This is the Cato Daily Podcast for Friday, March 20th, 2020. I'm Caleb Brown. Often low oil prices indicate something good and something bad, a harbinger of recession and lower input costs for many businesses. This time is different. Sharp declines in oil prices indicate both a recession, just as relatively few people are getting on the road. So what are the implications for foreign policy? Cato's Emma Ashford explains.
Well, it's been a pretty rough ride in the oil markets the last week. They dropped through, so the price of oil basically dropped through the floor last week. Sunday night into Monday morning, American time, we basically saw the price of oil go from where it had been about 55-ish dollars a barrel. And over the course of the last week, it has dropped until it is now somewhere in the vicinity of $25 a barrel. That is a low price that we have not seen. We didn't even see a price that low during the financial crisis in 2008. So this has been a massive disruption in the oil market.
What does that mean economically? The United States government, as far as I know, has purchased a lot of oil. What was the purpose of that?
Yeah, so for the US, there's a couple of things that matter. So one is that low oil prices are bad for US producers. We're now a major producer of energy with fracking and new wells. So in places like Texas or Western Pennsylvania or the Dakotas, those are big producing states now. And that's been part of sort of America's energy resurgence that's happened in the last few years, part of our economic resurgence, actually, in the last few years. And so for those producers, shale producers, it costs them somewhere around $25 to $35 to produce a barrel of oil. The fact that prices are so low is an absolute disaster for them. Um, and then there's sort of historically, oil prices are actually typically good for American consumers. So if the price of gas is low, you go, you fill up your car, you buy more stuff, etc., etc. So under normal circumstances, we would assume that the sort of negative part of the oil price being low would be balanced out by that sort of benefit of the oil price being low. But really, we're in a very strange and unprecedented situation here. Everybody is sheltering in place in their house. Nobody wants to fill up their car. Nobody wants to go to the mall and buy stuff. And so it's not clear that we're going to see that positive bounce. And the fall in the price of oil may end up just being bad for the American economy.
And the White House, for what it's worth, the president was tweeting out, "Hey, oil." Just a few months ago, oil prices are low. That's great.
Yes, well, the president has been pushing for low oil prices for quite some time. And I think that's because he's thinking of this sort of classic conception of oil prices, which is that, if they drop low, particularly if they drop low in an election year, it juices the US economy and it benefits us all. But with the coronavirus, that's not probably what's going to happen this time. It's probably going to end up hurting the US economy more than it helps it. And so President Trump may now be regretting that he spent much of 2020 and 2019 trying to convince the Saudis to produce more and drop the price of oil.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Russia and OPEC countries, but that's sort of part of the trigger here, or was that just a consequence of what was unfolding worldwide?
There's two things going on. So the first is this worldwide spread of the coronavirus. And so what we're seeing happen in America is happening everywhere, right? Demand is dropping. People are staying home. They're not traveling. Airline travel is down. I think United Airlines announced about a week ago that they were running at 30% capacity of normal. And so, all of that means less fuel used, less demand for oil. And so traders reacted to that. But then there's a second part to it, which is that the countries in OPEC and Russia and some other oil producers have this arrangement known as OPEC Plus that they've been running for about 3-4 years now. And they got together in Vienna. The Saudis proposed another round of cuts to try and stabilize the price of oil. They said, look, demand is falling from the coronavirus. We need to cut at least 1.5 million barrels. Everyone's going to have to chip in. We'll have to make this work. And the Russians said no. The Russians said, we don't think we should bear all of the costs of this. We want, like American producers and people that aren't here to bear some of these costs too. And we'd rather take a lower price than cut more production. And so the OPEC Plus deal just fell apart. And the Saudis, in response, said, fine, we're going to produce a lot more. We're going to compete with you for market share instead of cooperating with you. And the result is that we are in an era of sort of very much declining demand from the coronavirus, and skyrocketing supply. So there is way too much oil being pumped all around the world, and it's being stored in all sorts of really strange places, like tanker ships afloat in the ocean, because we have nowhere else to put it and no one wants to burn it. And so that altogether is why the price of oil is so low. And unless the two sides come back to the negotiating table, doesn't seem likely that it's going to go higher anytime soon.
Given the low price of oil and sort of a planned reduction in economic activity that seems to be going on all over the place, how does that change the U.S. relationships with other countries?
Well, so I mean, it highlights once again that U.S. economic interests do not necessarily align with Saudi economic interests anymore. So we saw this in 2014 when the Saudis made this arrangement with the Russians, and they all agreed that they would sort of pump more. They were trying to basically put American shale producers out of business in the hopes that, maybe if Saudi took sort of a temporary economic hit at that point with low prices, they could survive. The shale producers would go out of business, and then the Saudis would sort of have the market to themselves again. It didn't work then, obviously. Um, and they're doing something pretty similar now, right? They're trying to seize market share by pumping a lot because they can absorb low prices. And the goal here may not necessarily be to hurt US producers, but that is going to be the effect. And this is very different than it was in, the 1970s, 80s, where if the Saudis sort of pumped more oil and the price went down, that was typically good for the US economy. So we're just starting to see again in this crisis that Saudi interests and US interests really don't align at this point. In fact, the Saudis have more in common with the Russians than they do with us.
Is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that the United States has held on to, is it 30 million barrels of oil? Um, uh, is that rendered irrelevant or pointless, or is it a wait and see?
So the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is really important for energy security. It's actually something over 700 million barrels at this point. It's a lot of oil. We developed that in the 1970s after the oil embargoes, and what it does is it lets the American market ride out shocks internationally. So we produce a lot of oil, but we also still import a lot of oil from places like Canada and Mexico and elsewhere. We're a big consumer. We don't produce everything that we consume, and so it's in our interests to keep that market stable. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve basically lets the government say, well, things look really bad right now. We'll release some of that oil from the petroleum reserve, and that'll help to bring prices down. And so that's basically the function of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The only real way that that is figuring into this crisis is that the Trump administration has announced that it will buy oil for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve from some of these shale producers in an effort to sort of ease the economic pain for them. The problem is that there's a fairly finite amount of storage there, and so it's not going to it's not going to be enough for the shale producers. Even if we fill that reserve until it is absolutely brimming with oil, it's still not going to save American shale from what's happening.
Emma Ashford is a research fellow at the Cato Institute. Subscribe to the Cato Daily Podcast wherever you please and follow us on Twitter @Cato Podcast.